Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the main points of the selection Morals and Legislation by Jeremy Bentham. Now, I'm going to be going over these points while looking over the reading itself, because I'd like to help in any way I can to help you to understand the sometimes difficult readings. So I will be going through and summarizing and reading some passages and discussing it. And first, we're going to look at some questions that you can think about while doing the readings. But note that in answering these questions and understanding the reading fully, you will need to do the reading yourself and not just watch this video. Okay, I will post the questions underneath the link for the video. So let me share the screen here. There we go. Okay, so the questions here on Bentham are 8. What is the principle of utility? What is an action conformable, or when is an action conformable to the principle of utility? What is the principle of asceticism? What is the principle of asceticism not as a good? Why is the principle not as good? Should be not as good as the principle of utility. What is the principle of sympathy and antipathy? Why is the principle of sympathy and antipathy not as good as the principle of utility? How would one calculate the utilitarian value of an action? And can a motive be good and bad? Can a motive be good or bad in itself? Why or why not? Okay, so let's look at the reading now. Now, Jeremy Bentham's article here is a statement, of course, of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is very different, almost diametrically opposed to Kantian ethics, which I deal with in another video. So let's start off looking at Bentham's writing. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters. Okay, let's see here. Okay, let's see if this is working now. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. Now, here from the beginning, we see that Bentham is turning to psychology. Psychology as a discipline didn't really begin until the late 19th century. We have Bentham here writing a couple of hundred years before that. But he's turning to psychology in that he's saying that our moral theories, our moral ways of acting should follow the most settled ideas in psychology. And he thinks those are that as human beings, we follow necessarily pain and pleasure, that's what we do. Reading on the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. Now he's being a little metaphorical here. He's saying the throne of dictating what humans do, the throne is occupied by pain and pleasure. So pain and pleasure are dictating everything that we do. And so it should also dictate our standard of right and wrong. They govern us in all we do, okay? In all we say and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off their subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. Now he talks about the principle of utility as the foundation of the present work. So this is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism follows the principle. When you hear the word principle, think of rule. So the principle or rule of utility. And he's going to tell us what that means. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever. By the way, sometimes he uses the terms approbation or disapprobation, right? They're synonymous. Those words are synonymous with approves or disapproves. Or approves for approbation, disapproves is synonymous with disapprobation. Okay, so the principle of utility is meant, what is meant by the principle of utility is that principle or rule which approves of or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency. It looks like there's an errant period there. According to the tendency it appears to have to augment, right, increase, or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. By utility is meant that property, by the way, I will be skipping around because I don't have time to read the whole thing, and that would just be way too boring. So I'm just going to bore you a little bit, maybe more than you'd like, but in order to explain the reading, I think this is a good way to do it. So by utility is meant that property, right, that characteristic or feature in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. Okay. So, let's see here. Down. A thing is said to promote the interest or to be for the interest of an individual when it tends to add to the sum total of his pleasures, or what comes to the same thing, to diminish the sum total of his pains. Okay, that should be pretty self-explanatory. So an action then may be said to be conformable, right? Conformable. A lot of folks read this and they look at it too fast and they comfortable. Well, this is conformable. So able to conform or adhere to. An action then may be said to be conformable to, and that's a typo, I should say, the principle of utility. When the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. Okay, so it's an action is conformable to the principle of utility when it has a tendency to increase the happiness and diminish the pain of a community. Okay, so let's go down to here. This is all good writing to read and to fill in understanding. I'm just looking at a few highlights. A principle, okay? Now he's looking at principles adverse to that of utility. So we're going to look at two principles that he contrasts with utility to sort of make even more sense of what he means by principle of utility. So one is going to be asceticism, and the other is going to be what he calls sympathy and antipathy. So, you know, feeling good, feeling bad, right? By the principle of asceticism, you may have heard this word before. You've heard of perhaps religious ascetics who deny themselves food and water, they fast, or they medieval ascetics would sometimes sit on poles, like kind of like flag poles, and it would sit there and on all kinds of weather, and they wouldn't eat or anything. They're just like the weather. They'd have the weather hit them and things like that. So being an ascetic is being sort of in extreme self-denial. So what he means here is something a little less than that extreme self-denial, but we'll see. By the principle of asceticism, what he means is approving of actions in as far as they tend to diminish his happiness, disapproving of them in as far as they tend to augment it. So what he's saying here, asceticism is the opposite of the principle of utility. The principle of asceticism is something is considered good if it diminishes happiness, and the principle of utility is saying that something is good if it increases happiness. Okay, so it's the direct opposite. Right. So the principle of utility is capable of being consistently pursued. Okay, that's a good thing about the principle of utility, whereas the principle of asceticism never was, nor ever can be, consistently pursued. And in a day's time, if some 1/10 part of the inhabitants of the earth pursue asceticism consistently, they will have turned it into a hell. So what they mean is that if everyone were to follow the principle of utility and be trying to increase happiness in the world would be a better place. And at least they could consistently follow such a rule. But if everyone were to be acting according to asceticism, then the world would be a much worse place. It would be a kind of a hell, in the sense that everybody would be trying to diminish happiness and increase pain. By the principle, and now that's the second one, sympathy and antipathy. By the principle of sympathy and antipathy, I mean that principle which approves or disapproves of certain actions. And then this is, I'm just going to like close it here, come down to here with the sentence, merely because a man finds himself disposed to approve or disapprove of them. So what he's saying here is sympathy is liking something, antipathy is not liking something. So this is different than utility. Utility is trying to follow a rule whereby one tries to increase the net aggregate of happiness for the most people and reduce the most amount of pain. Whereas sympathy and antipathy is, if we lived by such a principle, we would only help things that we liked, that we just had feelings of like towards, and the opposite for antipathy. What one expects to find in a principle, and he's saying here why it's not as good of a principle as utility. What one expects to find in a principle, remember, like a rule, is something that points, something that points out some external consideration. So some external consideration as a means of warranting and guiding the internal sentiments of approval and disapproval. So with the principle of utility, we're using an external consideration, that is the increase of happiness for everyone. So there's this external consideration that we're using to justify how we act. This expectation is but ill fulfilled by a proposition. This is the principle of sympathy and antipathy, which does neither more nor less than hold up each of those sentiments, think of feelings here, or maybe emotions, hold up each of those sentiments as a ground and standard for itself. So it's a sort of an individual standard. There's no external consideration, as he says here. There's no external consideration as in the principle of utility. The principle of sympathy and antipathy just hold up feelings, personal feelings, as the ground and standard of acting. Now, how do we calculate the principle of utility? How do we calculate? How do we do? This is one way that utilitarians act. How do we perform or do a utilitarian calculation? Well, first of all, we think of all the different ways that utility can be valued. So we can value a pleasure according to its intensity. We can, like how much it is, its duration, how long it lasts, whether it's a certain, good or bad feeling, or uncertain. Its propinquity, that's a word that means nearness or farness or remoteness. And then he goes on to say its fecundity, the chance it has of being followed by other sensations, right? So we're going to tend to do those things that are not only those things that would make us feel good, but things that might lead to other things that would make us feel good. And the purity, or the chance of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind, like pain. So these are all considerations of how we value utility. And so obviously, if pleasures that are more intense, to have a longer duration, and so on, and for all of these, those are the kinds of considerations, those kinds of happiness that we want to promote, not just in ourselves, but for everyone, for the greatest good, for the greatest number. And let's see, here we have kind of a succinct explanation of how to actually do the calculus. So he says, so if we're trying to decide on two actions, we're going to ask the utilitarian question, which is, what are the results of the actions? Like if we're trying to decide whether to perform one or the other, which one leads to the greatest good and the least bad or suffering for the most people or animals even. Take an account, he says, of the number of persons whose interests appear to be concerned. So count up all of the people. Now, Bentham actually assumes that we're talking only about people, but if you read John Stuart Mill's utilitarian writings, he writes that he seems to be writing anyway. It's a little ambiguous in his work, but he seems to be leaving it open for non-human animals to be given consideration when deciding what is morally good or bad to do. But here, when we're making a utilitarian calculation, we take account of the number of persons whose interests are concerned, and we repeat the above process with respect to each. So we consider the intensity, the propinquity, the fecundity, all of those things. Sum up the numbers expressive of the degrees of good tendency with respect to each individual, and do the same thing as far as the bad. Then take the balance on the side. If it's on the side of pleasure, then it's a good tendency of the act. So essentially you assign units of pleasure or pain. That's one way to do it. Utilitarians will call this utils. We can assign utils, like positive utils or negative utils, and put it on a piece of paper and line everything up, and and then just count up the good over the bad. Now, he does say in his writings here that we don't have to always go to this much trouble, but this is the sort of ideal. This is what we should be sort of aiming for. He says here, it is not to be expected that this process should be strictly pursued previously to every moral judgment or legislative or judicial operation, but it should always be kept in view. In other words, we should always have in mind that this is sort of the ideal. So finally, he talks a bit about motives. And he kind of gives away his, no motive is either constantly good or constantly bad. And he discusses here his reasoning. See, every motive either has some pleasure or some pain. And so a motive is substantially nothing more than pleasure or pain. So the goodness or badness of a motive is there's no good or bad motives in themselves, right? It's only whether or not they lead to some good or bad outcome. And then there's some more on motives here that can fill in even more about this particular idea. Okay, I hope that this has been helpful to you in understanding this article. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you for your time and attention.